Hey folks, if you're a fan of the weird, today is apt to be a treat since I'm going to be diving into the review copy I received of developer Me3's Death of a Wish, the sequel to their earlier horror-infused spectacle fighter, Lucah, Born of a Dream. Which means it's time to ask the question, was there revelry to be found in this reverie, or did that wind up being wishful thinking? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. The world has all but ended, consumed by a nightmarish corruption that devours its inhabitants and leaves them as feral husks. And yet, as terrible as things may be, perhaps the worst atrocity is the Sanctum, a theocratic organization which seeks to control the lives of the sparse survivors which yet exist, with a doctrine built on suffering. A suffering which pales compared to the grim fates which await the marked, horned children who are especially vulnerable to the nightmare and which find themselves relentlessly hunted by the Sanctum. Which brings us to Christian, one of the marked who once belonged to the ranks of the Sanctum, but he's since defected and now engages in a one-man crusade to purge the organization from existence. A task which has been immensely complicated by the splinters forming in the church and the weight of his past trauma. Anyways, if you're a bit lost here, don't worry, this isn't a matter of its predecessor being necessary to understand the story, but rather due to the abstract nature of the world itself. That's not to say a bit of prior knowledge doesn't help, but there's a fair bit of the story that's more symbolic than literal. Which is to say, there's a lot more weight placed on Christian and his journey, and the way he chooses to execute his quest, and how those decisions cost him and the people he encounters. That said, if you are keen on knowing more about the world's setting, it does provide enough information to be able to piece together a decent enough picture, with some tail-end revelations hammering home just how messy everything is. As for how well it's executed, well, that depends. For people uncomfortable with religious horror, this might be difficult given the existence of the Sanctum and how central it is to the narrative. While the organization isn't necessarily a condemnation of Christianity, it's hard to ignore the way that Christian terminology and symbols are inescapably a part of Death of a Wish's world building. While some of these brutal elements are drawn from its more archaic practices, such as worshippers losing themselves to perpetual bouts of self-flagellation, as though it might free them from the nightmare, there's other more distinctly uncomfortable moments which feel much more current. Still, if that isn't a deal breaker, the world building itself is fascinating. Story-wise, the game alternates between dialogue sequences with characters, collectible memories you can discover, and then the prose segments. These latter elements feel very different from the majority of what you'll encounter because while a few are used to highlight thoughts in the moment, others drift more towards kinetic novelesque segments, providing bits of backstory for Christian, and occasionally veering into bits of dialogue that feel more like the author waxing poetic. Don't get me wrong, it's not bad, but tonally it's very different. Any case, what I can ultimately say about Death of a Wish on a narrative front is this. As far as sequels go, it does a solid job of existing as a self-contained story. While I did marginally benefit from playing Lucah, Born of a Dream, and got a few lingering questions answered, I really didn't need that context to enjoy the bulk of the story. Largely, it's a character study of someone damaged by abuse, how poorly they deal with it, and the gradual process of trying to get better, wrapped up in a figurative and literal nightmarescape. A journey that is rough, often painful for all of its characters, but which carries a certain sense of earnestness in how it tells its tale. Frankly, it's somewhat cathartic to engage with. But can I say the same about its mechanics? Well, much like its predecessor, Death of a Wish is a curious fusion of spectacle fighter and Soulslike, with a dash of adventure thrown into the mix. Admittedly, the combination of the first two genres might sound a bit daunting, but it's surprisingly accessible right from the get-go, in part due to the sin and punishment system, a pair of difficulty options you get to select at the beginning, but can be freely changed as you progress forward in order to get the sort of challenge you want. Overall, they're fairly self-explanatory, with sin dictating the difficulty of enemies and how quickly the corruption mechanic creeps up on you, while punishment is more a measurement of how much the game's death penalty sucks. And frankly, it does suck by default. While other Souls-likes tend to punish players by dropping their hard-earned experience at the location of their demise, and thus goading them to return to the area that killed them, Death of a Wish simply unpersons a chunk of your experience. Technically, the fact that it doesn't take everything is nice, but the simple fact of the matter is that experience is gone for good, which makes dying really sting by default. Admittedly, this also scales up your corruption meter, but actually, let's get into that right now. So, corruption is a measure of how close Christian is to succumbing to the nightmare and becoming one himself. By default, it slowly increases during combat and spikes up whenever an enemy successfully lands a hit, and when he dies. That said, initially I found this to be a bit of a nothing burger, even though I played through the game as a complete glass cannon. See, whenever you get into combat, there's a style meter, provided you can clear out fights without getting hit, and while stringing together a decent combo in a timely fashion, Christian will actually restore some of his corruption meter, for a total of 3% if he gets an S rank, which I should note is a surprisingly large chunk of corruption, to the point that you can very easily offset the losses incurred by a death or few if you play well. And frankly, the game gives you all the tools needed to do just that. First off, rather than providing you a supply of healing potions whenever you visit a bonfire checkpoint, you'll receive a set number of rewinds, which enable you to restart a fight from the beginning in order to avoid taking unnecessary damage, as well as helping you manage your corruption by negating the hits you've taken and allowing you a better chance at getting an S rank. It also lets you farm experience, since you keep everything you've earned when you rewind. Now, that's not to say there aren't healing potions as a note, since you can find some from certain harvestable points, but well, you can only carry a few, they're pretty scarce initially, and again, I played as a glass cannon, they weren't really that useful to me. Thankfully, dodging in this game provides you more than enough iframes to get through attacks if you're paying attention, and a very solid gap closer since there's not much in the way of an attack delay. What's more, you have a parry and it is extremely good. The inputs are forgiving, and enemy attacks tend to be well telegraphed, letting you chain them back to back, and in doing so, lets you toss out boosted counterattacks and chunk away an enemy's stagger bar. And once their stagger bar is empty, they just slump over and let you beat on them for amplified damage. Learn it and love it because it ends fights quickly. Also, it really does help that the parry is actually tied to your dodge, because yeah, no, it is very forgiving. But yeah, this was a bit of a tangent, just so I could loop this all back to the corruption meter, because, well, I never actually saw what it did until New Game Plus because of the simple fact that you have all of those tools needed to avoid it catching up to you. So when I hit New Game Plus, I expressly ramped up the punishment and then died a whole bunch to find out. And once I did, I actually regretted the fact that I didn't do so earlier. See, upon being consumed by corruption for the first time, you're punted back to the start of the game after a certain scene, albeit with a new pair of mechanics unlocked. One is a chapter reversion, a means of rolling yourself back to an earlier segment of the game, albeit as strong as you were and with everything you've unlocked, so you can try and get further in without getting consumed by your corruption. Which you'd think wouldn't be that much of a problem given how smoothly I went through my first playthrough, but it also unlocks a transformation state, a super mode that just cranks your damage to an absurd degree, allowing you to lay waste to hordes of enemies or bosses alike. Only, it also happens to drastically increase the speed at which you gain corruption over time, while simultaneously preventing you from gaining an S rank in combat, making the management of your corruption a much more pressing matter. It's genuinely neat and certainly adds another layer to the gameplay, especially once you factor in the fact that there's an aria, a prayer, and a virtue, that scales off of you having higher corruption, essentially tempting a player to make that gamble in order to maximize their damage output. Which, right, so that was a whole lot of words and no context. So, Arias serve as your weapons in this game, each one providing you a distinct set of moves, their elemental affinities they hit, and also some interesting passives. And they're all quite useful even if some are more situational than others. Small aside here, I quite literally stuck with the base Aria Soul for a vast portion of the game because its passive ability causes its damage to scale up the more hits that you chain together, which can scale up to some pretty absurd degrees. And that's without even factoring in your later ability to fuse Arias together once you gain more. Now technically, not all Arias can be paired together, but you wind up having a fairly broad amount of options at your disposal, which allows you to tweak the way the damage scales, their passives, and even the movesets. And remember that whole spiel about being a glass cannon? The other half of why I did that is because the stat I chose to dump everything in causes the passive element of Arias to scale up. Which is to say, oh man, did that combo damage scale up. And then you layer prayers on top of this, and things just get silly. Prayers are essentially additional passives you can slot into a weapon, such as more attack range, scaling off corruption, improving the weapon's passive ability, or even changing which stat an Aria scales off, such as making Soul scale off the stat that was boosting its passive. While you're only able to attach a couple to an Aria, the combinations allow for all sorts of shenanigans, like what I just mentioned, and you're provided a pair of loadouts you can freely swap between, so you can adjust tactics as needed, such as being able to break out of melee combat to play keep away with a long-range Aria to generate energy in order to use your ranged familiars and charged attacks. Because, yeah, no, you have little ranged abilities, and every single Aria has unique charged attacks, which can really help to do decisive hits. Here's the thing though, that's not even the whole of character building. The last piece of the puzzle is the virtues, which are general passives that apply to Christian, ranging from the defensive, such as dropping to 1 HP rather than dying once a fight, to more risky options, like cranking the damage you take in order to deal more. Those two pair beautifully, by the way. On the whole, there's a fairly broad amount to find, and you're able to mix and match them with your only real limit being skill points, which can be boosted to a fair degree by finding collectible rosaries. So, yeah, I've talked a lot about the combat in this game because the game is quite combat-centric, to the point that you can expect to get into a fight almost every room or so, beyond a few hub areas, but that isn't the whole of it by any stretch of the imagination. See, when I mentioned that the game has some adventure elements, it's due to there being a fairly broad world to explore, to the point that I found myself more often than not meandering off the beaten path and just stumbling over new abilities, extra rosaries and rewinds, as well as optional bosses and story beats. Exploring in Death of a Wish just feels incredibly rewarding, and I'd be hard-pressed to think of a time where my exploration efforts didn't feel worthwhile. Even if it was just something as simple as a shortcut or locating an area I'd need to double back to later. And I don't just mean because I didn't have a keycard at the time. Oh no, see, earlier on in the game you get a teleport. It lets you zip around towards certain anchor points. Initially, this is a fairly situational traversal tool, but it also sees occasional use in some combat segments since it does let you move a fair bit further than the dodge. That said, Christian eventually gets an unrestricted version of this, which not only shines in combat, but also makes the act of re-exploring the map feel rewarding, since you now have access to a lot more secret areas and shortcuts in general, which really takes the sting out of the thing that happens to your fast travel network. But yeah, while that does sum up the overarching complexity of how exploration is tackled, it's genuinely just good. Like, one of the highlights for me was being able to wander into the subway station, a relatively late game area, nearly out the gate, only to fight my way through its nightmarish gauntlet and emerge into an area that I otherwise would have found around the halfway mark of the game. That sort of freedom to explore is just so neat. Though, if I'm going to continue to focus on the whole active exploration, I do feel now is a good time to tackle aesthetics. See, if you've been following along, it's pretty obvious to see that Death of a Wish's visuals are unique. There's a very rough-drawn, abstract nature to the creatures you encounter, the world itself, as well as the attacks, and on a certain level, I do think it works. You're able to parse the world for what it is, and it definitely makes for a memorable experience. That said, it's not entirely flawless. While I can certainly appreciate the stylistic elements, there are times where it can lead to an obscured presentation, mostly when it comes to a clustered melee. Thankfully, the game is kind enough to signal when an enemy is about to attack, and whether it's an attack you can parry or need to dodge through, which helps during those moments where you might otherwise lose track of your position. And then we get to a particular element of the UI. Now, it's not the menus. I found those fairly easy to navigate. No, the whole thing of why I felt exploration and a talk about aesthetics really comes to mind is the fact that the map gives me a headache. You see, the map is drawn in the same way as the world itself, except that it condenses the entirety of a region into a jagged, hand-drawn style, which can make it an absolute nightmare to parse the finer details and to figure out where a little side passage might be, because some things look like they should connect but don't. While it does help with the broad strokes, I highly recommend making notes of anything you might want to double back for, like keycards, and even to possibly doodle your own notes on where exits and entrances are and if you've been somewhere before. But yeah, beyond that, there are a few novel visual elements you'll encounter, but the largest one comes near the end of the game, and while I don't want to get much into the sake of it for spoilers, it definitely feels like a weird juxtaposition stylistically. As for the sound design, well, I quite like it. The music is great as ever, and in fact, you're very likely to recognize a number of tracks from the first game. If I have to be nitpicky, there's just something about the impact noises when you get hit that grates a bit, and the sheer speed at which you can spam attacks and dodges can get a bit distracting for the noises they make. But on the whole, it really is minor, since at the end of the day, I do recommend Death of a Wish. While the subject matter for the story can be a bit bleak, and definitely touches on some fairly uncomfortable topics, it's interesting to explore all the same. Also, unlike Lucah, there's only one ending, so you can get the full experience from a singular playthrough if you're the sort to obsess over story elements. There is also, like I mentioned earlier, New Game Plus if you did miss some small side content and wanted to dive back for it, and the chapter select does help for that. And I'm not kidding, there is an ample amount of side content and exploration to do, to the point that you'll always be able to find a challenge. The final optional bosses are brutal. That said, it's also as accessible as it needs to be. Even with the spike in difficulty between the vanilla playthrough and New Game Plus, you always retain the ability to shift around the sin and punishment difficulty elements of the game, and you have a modular set of accessibility options which more or less ensure that even those who are simply here for a story will still see things through. If you like the game but want to change things up further, there's even a randomizer mode you can fiddle around with once you've finished the game. Simply put, it is an extremely solid title and one which I binged from start to finish, so I'd be remiss if I didn't call it a very strong example of a hit. With that said, I'd also like to make a bit of an addendum here. If you haven't played Lucah, it is a great time, and if you dig this game, it'll likely resonate with you as well. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, you can check the description, where you'll also find my link to my Patreon, so you can support my channel like Shrimp Mania, Green Witch Babby, and Andy Noted, and find a link to my merch house, which has neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.